The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
I gather you guys have been talking about all kinds of aspects of consciousness in neuroscience and in philosophy in recent weeks. A little bit of, and you talked a little bit about the philosophical problems that consciousness poses. So I've thought a reasonable amount about consciousness. Done some things from the point of view of philosophy, stressing the difficulties, the challenges that consciousness poses for neuroscientific explanation, in particular for reductionist explanation. And I gather you've talked a bit about that. Today I'm just going to talk a bit about, from a somewhat more, I guess, constructive perspective about how the science of consciousness might look. I mean, you might think that once you really acknowledge the really serious difficulties of consciousness and argue against the possibility of purely reductive explanation of consciousness in terms of neural or computational processing, and this leaves you without an avenue to do the science of consciousness. Now, I don't think that's right at all, despite being skeptical about the reductionist approach. I think the science of consciousness is active and, thriving, and there aren't, in principle, impossibility barriers that I can see to its success. So if you like, this paper, I gather you've had a look at this paper, How to Construct the Science of Consciousness. I mean, that in a way it can be seen as trying to sketch how a science of consciousness might look, even once you've accepted these particular principled limitations on, say, reductive approaches, explaining consciousness wholly in terms of neural and computational processing. So, if you like, I gather you've talked a bit about materialism and dualism, so the kind of science of consciousness that even a dualist can accept. At the same time, I'd like to think that the model I give in that paper for how a science of consciousness can proceed is also one that ought to be acceptable to a lot of physicalists and agnostics and so on who don't know what to make of the philosophical issues. I think one thing we've discovered in the last 15, 20 years since the science of consciousness has really been exploding within neuroscience, psychology, and other areas, is that it's possible to make really serious and significant progress on the science of consciousness without solving the mind-body problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and so on, without resolving those metaphysical mysteries. You kind of proceed constructively in a way that acknowledges the problems without solving them. You still get a serious and significant science. That's the program which I try to outline in this paper on constructing a science of consciousness. So, the initial distinction in that paper, I know in this other work, which maybe you've talked about, stressing the problems of explaining consciousness in physical terms. There's this distinction between the easy problems, explaining various cognitive functions, behavioral functions, like the distinction between being awake and asleep, perceptual discrimination, integration, and report, and the hard problem of explaining subjective experience in terms of physical processes. Now, in this new context of trying to think about how science might look, I prefer to reconfigure that distinction in a slightly different way, and that's the distinction between first-person data and third-person data. So here the thought is just to proceed like a botanist or something, just try to catalog the phenomena that need to be explained, that we want the science of in a science of consciousness. And those will include various phenomena objectively measurable from the third-person point of view, in particular. So these are the third-person data, which are primarily going to be data about behavior and data about brain processes. So various aspects of my behavior that you might monitor in the lab, including my responsiveness, my ability to discriminate, my ability to report, and indeed data about my brain processes, such as you might get from a brain scanner. In many fields, even in many fields of cognitive science, these third-person data sort of exhaust the primary data that we want to explain for science. They maybe learning, most of the science of learning or language and so on. These arguably exhaust these are at least the central data that we want to explain. Maybe there's some role for the first-person data there. But when it comes to the science of consciousness, there's another distinctive source of data we have about the phenomena, distinctive access to phenomena that needs to be explained. And these are the first-person data of subjective experience. Roughly, there are different ways to flesh this out rigorously, but roughly third-person data are the kind of data you get by objectively measuring a system from the third-person point of view. First-person data, those data you have from the first-person point of view by being a system and accessing distinctive properties of that system from the first-person perspective. And in particular, there appear to be these data, the data of consciousness or of subjective experience, to which we have some kind of distinctive access from the first-person point of view. So data about my visual experiential states right now. There's something it's like to see you guys, something it's like to hear, something it's like to feel my body, to experience emotion, maybe even something it's like to think. Now, I think we have data about those things. It's just a datum about, say, visual perception, that there is something it's like to see. It's as undeniable as the third-person datum that people can discriminate and report their various bits of the visual world. And that's a datum. So I think that a science of consciousness would be incomplete without an explanation of those data. You might actually argue that when it comes to the distinctive problems of consciousness, those first-person data, in a way, are the central data for a science of consciousness to explain. Certainly the distinctive data for a science of consciousness to explain. And this, I think, really does make for a difference in kind between a difference in character between the science of consciousness and other familiar models throughout science. When it comes to explaining, say, genetic phenomena, I mean, it's arguable that all the central data there are third-person data about how it is that certain characteristics get transmitted from one generation to the next. It's a kind of third-person data. And we have models for how explanation of those things work in science. I mean, the most central kinds of third-person data are very frequently the kinds of phenomena here that need explaining, language use, learning, transmission of genetic information, and so on. They can often be characterized in terms of the performance of certain objective functions. And we have a great model for the explanation of data of that sort of phenomenon, of that sort. It's basically, to explain the performance of one of these objective functions, you specify a mechanism. Typically well, in the case of DNA, it's a molecular mechanism. The DNA structure, which plays this role of encoding information from about certain characteristics and passing them on to the next. And what's an empirical before the hypothesis? DNA can do this. You get so let's throw how it performs this function. You get an explanation of a rudimentary explanation of genetic phenomena, the functions of what need to be explained. Likewise, maybe when it comes to explaining the third-person data about consciousness associated with responsiveness and rapport, and so on. But it looks like this model doesn't work so well when you've got these first-person data that additionally need explaining. And one way of getting at that is to make the case, even upon explaining all these different objective functions associated with consciousness, explaining discrimination, integration, responsiveness, report, and so on. There's still going to be this further question: why are there states of subjective experience that go along with these, perhaps intimately connected and intimately correlated with these? But still, why should they exist at all? Why don't these third-person states go on in the absence of subjective experiences? And Alex tells me you guys have talked about zombies and conceivability and so on. We can imagine all that processing going on without consciousness, and that's one way to bring out the point here, and that's useful for certain purposes. But I think the basic point is could be made even without using those, just as a basic explanatory question to explain those things. This doesn't seem to add up to an explanation of subjective experience on its own. There's actually there's really two separate points here. One is just a basic point about the data that need explaining. You just listed all the third person data, the data of particular very subjective functions, maybe even the brain processes as well. And you've just said that's the catalog of what needs to be explained. Explain those things and we're done. And it looks like you've got an incomplete catalog of the data here. I mean, the first person data, subjective experiences, really are primary phenomena in the science of consciousness. So at least as scientists, trying to give an explanation of the phenomena, these need to be included on the list of things that need to be explained. So, hopefully few people are going to argue with that, although there are some people out there. I know Dan Dennis giving some talks this week. And I guess Dan's view is that really all it needs explaining are the third person data of consciousness. Well, I think he goes back and forth, but basically he thinks explain the third person data and explain the various functions and so on, the various behaviors, the various roles, and so on, and you thereby explain the data of the first person data of consciousness. For example, explain the various reports that people make and other reactive phenomena associated with this. You thereby explain subjective experience. You shouldn't think there's a further problem of explanation or a further data that needs explaining. Sometimes around here I like to take polls, but this is a basic intuitive I think this is a point of division in the field. I mean, everything in this field is controversial somewhere or another. But one of the basic intuitive starting points is whether you think there is a further explanation, something else that needs explaining, such that explaining all these third-person phenomena of explaining report, explaining reactions, explaining discrimination, and so on, doesn't suffice to explain. So maybe I'll take a quick poll. So if you think that explaining the various third-person phenomena, report, reactions, discrimination, integration, responsiveness, and so on, thereby suffices. You think doing that automatically suffices to explain consciousness. There's no further deep problem of explaining the, for example, the data of subjective experience. Then raise your hand. Maybe I put that in the way that came out really loaded.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a further problem, upon explaining these various easy problems, upon explaining report, reaction, responsiveness, make them as sophisticated as you like, there's still a further really significant problem of explaining the first person data of experience. Okay, a few agnostics, maybe it's 2-1, let's say. I was wondering how people were going to have been shaped in their opinions by earlier discussions in the course. Lots of people on the fence, which is appropriate. Anyway, so I think there is this basic intuition shared by a majority, but not everyone, that there's really something further here needs explained. And then the question is, how do you explain it? Well, I've argued that in fact you can't explain these first-person data of experience wholly in reductive terms, basically because the methods we have of reductive explanation are really designed and appropriate for the explanation of these objective functions. The third person, there's a very strict argument for that, argument I give in the paper, that explanation in terms of underlying physical processes is all ultimately in terms of structure and dynamics, microscopic structure and dynamics, gives you great explanations of all kinds of complicated macroscopic structure and dynamics, including all kinds of weird and interesting emergent phenomena as you find in the study of complex systems. Still, it's only an explanation of structure and dynamics, which is great for explaining for solving the various third-person easy problems of consciousness. But when it comes to explaining experience, it looks like straight explanations of macrophysical structure and dynamics don't suffice to explain consciousness. We've already seen that explaining consciousness requires something more than explaining those. Therefore, explanation in those wholly, say, physical terms doesn't add up to an explanation of consciousness. Now, obviously, there's a huge amount more to be said about that, and all of that has been said by bunches of people. But that's the beginning of an argument against a wholly reductionist approach to consciousness. And then I go on to make a case for a non-reductive view. But maybe that's the point to pause.
Can you explain a bit more what you mean by structure and dynamics?
Yeah, boy, I was hoping I wouldn't have to do that. Yeah, so obviously there is structure and dynamics of a certain kind in consciousness as well. I guess what I really think is the relevant kind of structure and dynamics is spatiotemporal structure, causal structure, and maybe the kinds of basic structures you find in microphysical theories like quantum mechanics, which arguably goes beyond spatiotemporal and causal structure, structures in open spaces, and so on. I mean, in philosophical terms, it comes down to, I think, descriptions of systems which can be given in a theoretical form, whose ultimate terms, whose primitive terms, some kind of philosophers who know about Ramsey sentences, where there is an object which plays such and such a role, and so on, whose primitive terms are spatiotemporal and perhaps causal or lawful. So they're basically about causal dynamics among spatiotemporal structures. I mean, the treatment of things like quantum mechanical wave function spaces is very true. But insofar as those spaces are involved in physics, they're purely formal differences. We've got abstract mathematical structures here, if you like, allow some mathematical structures as well. And the claim is that putting together structures and dynamics of those kinds, spatiotemporal, causal, and formal structure, adds up to a lot of spatiotemporal, causal, and formal structure, putting dynamics over that structure, I guess, including the temporal part of spatiotemporal. But explaining that sort of structure doesn't suffice to explain consciousness. Does that help a bit?
It does.
Any other thoughts at this point? That's already true. So that's the pessimistic part of the talk over. The negative. That's the negative program about difficulties for reductive explanation, about the distinction between the problems. Any other issues that anyone wants to raise at that point? Okay.
So you mentioned consciousness. Do you think there are other areas that are similarly likely to non-reduce, like agency, free will, things like that?
Yeah, speak an arbitrary example.
Yeah. I could have said thousands of them.
I mean, there are obviously various aspects of the mind that at least raise worries about reduction, agency, intentionality, self. I guess my own suspicion is that although there are some prima facie worries here, the most serious worry in each of these cases about reduction is tied to the conscious aspect of these phenomena, such as the experience of will and agency, the experience of intentionality and representation, and so on. So I think those all pretty clearly pose problems analogous to the ones that come up and say the experience of perception and so on. I don't think, although philosophers often concentrate on perception, I don't think that the explanatory problems raised there are really distinctive. So certainly the experience of agency, the experience of intentionality does. And the question, I suppose the question then is whether there's a further aspect of these problems. I mean, of course, there are various prima facie issues that are shy in the case of intentionality, worries about determinism and compatibilism and so on in the case of agency and so on. I guess those are serious philosophical problems. I don't see them as posing as gaping an explanatory gap as one does in the case of consciousness. And in those areas, I'm inclined to think there are moves that can be made. It's just, at least once you've made it, once you've got the physical basis plus the experiential part, you've got the tools for a reasonable explanation. Now, that's my philosophical view. And that's my view.
Intentionality is a piece of jargon that doesn't
Okay, intentionality is basically.
Maybe you could just say, there's no need to explain it.
Good, yeah. So intentionality is basically, it doesn't, as philosophers use it, doesn't mean intention and deciding to do stuff and intending to do stuff and so on. It just basically means representation or about thinking about things in the world. So I think about my mother, my thought is about my mother, I look at you guys, and that looks like my visual perception is representing you guys. So philosophers put this for some bizarre reason by saying that these states have intentionality, which is one of the most confusing words for non-philosophers you can find, because not only does it sound the same as intention and the sense relevant in the philosophy of action, there's also this other term, intentionality with an S, which I won't even bother to explain, But anyway, so that's the problem of representing the world. And it does, and philosophers actually pursue these two things on the same on different tracks: the study of intentionality, the study of consciousness. It's a bit odd itself in a way, because it seems to be clear these two things have an awful lot to do with each other. In recent years, people have really started to focus on taking the two of them together. Alex has been a pioneer here. So certainly I think there's much about intentionality which is intrinsically conscious. That raises analogous to my race question: does intentionality raise further worries, unconscious intentionality, for example, or worries not tied to consciousness? Well, there are worries here, but I don't think they're escaping, I guess. Yeah.
There's a view that one might get out of Russell and Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, that all our knowledge of the world, that we do from the third person point of view, is structural dynamic, as you were saying.
Yeah.
But then there would be some intrinsic nature, and maybe that's about consciousness, what Russell calls knowledge of acquaintance, isn't the best expression. But we might think there are stories about the intrinsic nature of dark matter, superstrings, whatever, and science isn't going to tell us what these things intrinsically are, since it's just going to give us some mathematical description of the structure and dynamics. So one might think consciousness is pointing at that distinction, but maybe there's a lot more there.
Look, that's a very natural way to catch this distinction out. I don't want to be committed to catching it out that way and making the distinction between structure and dynamics and consciousness, because that involves a whole lot of theoretical commitment. But I am very sympathetic with this Russellian view that our knowledge of the physical world is basically purely structural. Well, Russell originally intended this from a very strong sense of purely structural, basically sort of logical structure. Just a bunch of entities related by a bunch of relations whose nature isn't specified, and so on. And then, for reasons familiar in philosophy, it looks like that just can't work. It goes back to problems raised by the mathematician Max Newman, that descriptions of this kind turn out to be vacuous. They can be satisfied by any set. It's going to be some set of relations and any set to have this structure. So you need a somewhat more specific structure than that, something like involving specific relations, maybe spatiotemporal relations or causal relations. So if we allow that kind of structure, a structure with some relations specified, basically a structure of the world, our fundamental grip on the world is of entities related in certain spatiotemporal and causal terms, then I'm not at all unsympathetic with the idea that that's really what something like physics is giving us, and that structure of that kind doesn't suffice to explain consciousness. Okay, so I should move on to the positive program. So if all that's right, then okay, so purely reductive explanation of consciousness, wholly in terms of neural computational processes, doesn't work. This doesn't mean you have to give up on science. Some pretty central parts of science are not reductive. We don't always try to explain phenomena wholly in terms of lower level phenomena. For example, in physics, when it comes to the explanation of things like space and time, we don't try to get rid of the notion. We don't try to explain space-time in terms of something more fundamental. I guess there are a few developing physical theories that try to do just that. We needn't do just that. I mean, look at classical Newtonian physics, or even classical relativity. Then notions like space-time are taken as basic. Don't try to explain them in terms of more basic things. You just try to figure out the principles by which space-time works and how it connects to everything else in the world, mass, charge, and so on. And give a set of laws that govern them. Likewise, we need charge and electromagnetic theory, and so on. You don't have a reductive theory of that. So I'm sympathetic with the idea that a theory of consciousness needn't try to reduce it to something more basic. Say that consciousness fundamentally is an underlying neural structure. You can just take consciousness for granted as a primitive in the theory, the way that a physicist might take space and time as primitive. But then what a science of consciousness should be doing is basically looking at what are the principles that govern consciousness, and in particular, what are the principles that connect it to everything else in the world that we know about. And obviously some of the especially relevant stuff is in terms of connecting consciousness to the rest of the world is going to be connected to the physical processes that are associated with consciousness, and most directly in the first instance, perhaps with physical processes in the brain. I mean, no question, but there's a really systematic and intimate connection between processes in the brain processes in consciousness. Affect the brain, you affect consciousness. I mean, it looks like there's a very serious dependence there. And you needn't be a reductionist to think that there can be a very detailed and systematic science of the way that consciousness depends on the brain. More generally, I think, what we basically follow this model, you basically want to admit the third-person data as certain third-person data as basic, and admit the first-person data. Don't try and wholly explain the first-person data in terms of the third-person data, but just take some of these data as basic and try to build an explanatory connection between the two, the realm of, say, brain and behavior, and the realm of consciousness. And that, in fact, I think if you look at what's been going on in the exploding science of consciousness over the last 20 years or so, it's, I think, very much a project of that kind. I mean, it's actually, if you really look at the science in detail, there's actually very little made in the way of productive claims that consciousness fundamentally is such and such a process. Doing this explains consciousness. I mean, some scientists make these claims when they write about this stuff, but this is usually kind of wearing their philosopher hat, and it doesn't usually fall out of the science itself. Instead, what you get is a really detailed systematic science, if you like, of correlations and principles connecting brain processes and consciousness. Perhaps the paradigm of this is the research project on neural correlates of consciousness. I'm sure it must be something you guys have talked about. Consciousness is only a recent part of this class, is that right?
That's
okay,
right.
so you haven't gotten to all of that. But the project of looking for neural correlates of consciousness is the project of trying to find certain neural systems in the brain whose states are closely associated with states of consciousness, and ultimately even minimal, some maximally specific systems in the brain whose states are closely associated with states of consciousness. It doesn't appear that every part of the brain is equally relevant to consciousness. So the program is to try and narrow it down. Now, this program has been developing in a lot of areas, but it's certainly been at its most sophisticated and detailed in the science of visual consciousness. We have these, I think you've talked about vision, at least, not necessarily visual consciousness. And you've got these incredibly complicated oil tanker refinery diagrams of the different areas involved in the different brain areas involved in visual processing. And we can then raise the question of all these areas, different stages of the visual pathways, which bits are the most closely associated with consciousness, in the sense that those are the ones essentially, affecting those things will affect consciousness. Now, actually, even posing that question isn't totally straightforward. What do you mean by this is the bit that's most closely associated with consciousness? I mean, it's not to say that if you just took the, just say it's like inferior temporal cortex or something. It doesn't mean if you just took out inferior temporal cortex and put it in a vat without the rest of the brain and changed the states, you then get states of consciousness. It's got to be that neural system or area, which against the background of the rest of the brain in normal conditions gives you variations in consciousness. And that raises a bunch of tricky issues that I've written about. But still, there seems to be a question here worth addressing. I mean, some of the most interesting work here has come from work on monkeys. Some of you may know the work that Neuroscientists and some of his colleagues have done on binocular rivalry in monkeys. I think I talked about that in the paper, where basically the thought is you've got the phenomenon of binocular rivalry. You put different stimuli to the two eyes, maybe a horizontal grating to one eye, a vertical grating to the other. Now I'll do that do that to one of us, and we get a kind of an alternating experience, horizontal for a while, vertical for a while, maybe checked, get a bit of both for a while. So one thought is, okay, well that's a variation in consciousness. And interestingly, a variation in consciousness without varying the stimulus. That's particularly useful for purposes of doing the science here, because, okay, one thought is we just do that to us, see what we're conscious of at a given time, monitor what's going on in my brain, and find out which bits of the brain seem to co-vary most directly with my states of consciousness. Now, it turns out we can't do this in humans because brain imaging methods are just not sufficiently fine-grained to be able to get at the difference between, to be able to really easily get at the difference between representing vertical lines and horizontal lines, although there are some methods people have tried to develop with large-scale structures in the visual cortex. But it's much easier to do if you can monitor single cells in the brain, because we know that there are cells tuned to responding to horizontal lines and cells tuned to responding to vertical lines. Hard to do those experiments on humans because you've got to drill a hole in the skull, put the electrode in, and most people aren't wild about having that happen to them unless they're already had to happen for medical reasons. People have done those experiments in a few cases. I guess you guys know about the results where they stuck the electrodes into the skull of various surgical patients and found the Jennifer Aniston cell and the O.J. Simpson cell and so on. But but people do these experiments on monkeys. So Logothetis trained these monkeys to basically give you kind of prototypical reports of what it's experiencing when it sees horizontal lines and vertical lines. Like this lever for when it's presented with a horizontal stimulus, and this one presented with a vertical stimulus, and both when it gets checked or something. And then for the okay, now we'll give it rivalrous stimulants, and it basically goes to I don't know, something like that. And then I give it okay, we'll stick electrodes into its brain and see when do its which cells in the brain. We know that certain cells, we can figure out that certain cells are tuned for horizontal or vertical lines, and then figure out in these conditions of rivalry which cells follow what the monkey reports to be the case, and which ones follow just the stimulus. And it turns out, you do this in say primary visual cortex, you don't find a very good correlation between the responsiveness, say, of horizontal and vertical cells and what the monkey reports. But you go later on in the visual pathway to IT, inferior temporal cortex, and you find a much better, a very good correlation between when the monkey reports seeing the horizontal grating, then a whole bunch of the horizontal cells are firing roughly, and when the monkey reports seeing vertical grating, a whole bunch of the vertical cells are firing. So, okay, so there's a thought. Inferior temporal cortex is, at least as far as that evidence is concerned, a much better candidate to be a neural correlate of consciousness than V1, primary visual cortex. Now that's just one piece of data, and there's a whole bunch of other data, and it really is still a raging controversy. I think there are people who have come up with various considerations in favor of V1 being a correlate here. But still, that's an example of the kind of work that's going on here. And this is work, I think, quite obviously, you can buy into whether you're a reductionist or a non-reductionist about consciousness, because it's basically a program of correlations. These activity in these brain areas correlates with activity in consciousness. And I think if you look at this entire program, there's nothing there to give any particular support to reductive approaches. But what there is a detailed science of correlation between this third-person realm, brain processes, and the first-person data of visual consciousness. The same could be said for a whole bunch of other research programs here, including the research programs for very active research programs for distinguishing conscious and unconscious processes. Conscious versus unconscious perception, conscious versus unconscious learning and memory, or implicit and explicit learning and memory, as people often call it. These are basically cases where certain kinds of behavioral capacities to discriminate, to be sensitive to information in the past, can be instantiated consciously, and maybe in the most familiar examples are instantiated consciously, but can also, in principle, be instantiated unconsciously. So there is unconscious perceptual sensitivity to information, unconscious influences of information about the past, and so on. Then, interesting question. Now, that distinction between conscious and unconscious processing, well, that can be cashed out in a bunch of different ways, some of which are purely third-personal. But I think one of the ways of cashing it out is in terms of the presence or absence of certain sorts of subjective experience. So, explicit memory could be understood, or conscious memory could be understood as the kind of memory that goes along with a certain phenomenology of remembering, whereas implicit memory is not. That's a distinction in first-person data, if you like. Then we find out certain things in the first-person realm, certain capacities that co-vary with this. So maybe there are certain things that conscious perception can do functionally that unconscious perception can't. For example, I think when it comes to unconscious perception of linguistic information, at least a few years ago when I was looking at this stuff carefully, there was some pretty decent evidence for, say, semantic processing of individual words. You see a word like chair, and then later on you might be primed to recognize the word chair again faster, or recognize chairs faster. and so on, but not much evidence of processing of complex syntactic and semantic structures. You know, if you had something about the cat is on the table, you'd be trying for cats and trying for tables, but not trying for cats being on tables. I guess there was a controversy about Mummy and I are one. They present people that subliminally the stimulus Mummy and I are one, and they found people had all kinds of warm and fuzzy feelings from this. I don't know what you think about that, Griffin. Priming for that complex structure. I guess other people argued in turn, maybe that just came down to positive priming from Mummy and I and one, or added up individually. Okay, but that's an example of correlating a first-person distinction with a third-person distinction of certain functions. And so that's another project here called the science of consciousness. Mapping certain first-person distinctions onto certain third-person distinctions, finding principles by which the two things go together. Ultimately, what we want to do here is to systematize this sort of connection into certain principles with a certain kind of generality, not just say, well, this brain area, this state of consciousness, unconscious perception, conscious perception versus unconscious perception, this difference in capacities, but some really pretty detailed and systematic principles for mapping, say, spaces of brain states or computational states onto states of consciousness. And that's a project which is still very much under development. I don't think we've got a whole lot in the way of really detailed systematic accounts there. It's very, very limited domains. But you can see that in the coming decades, I think there's a prospect for the development of theories of that kind. The ultimate aim for someone like me is that maybe we'll, as we start to develop some systematic and general principles connecting, say, first-person data and third-person data, we might ultimately be able to infer the fundamental principles that govern this connection, the simple, basic, and universal fundamental principles that connect physical processes to consciousness. After all, if I'm right that consciousness involves something fundamental and primitive in the way that space and time are fundamental and primitive, it'll be governed by some fundamental laws, and at least elsewhere in science. Well, fundamental laws are the ones you take as basic, you don't further explain. Now, okay, so you have to do that somewhere in science. You don't get explanation for free. But the thought is always that, you at least want your simple and basic, your unexplained basic laws to be as simple as possible. So you take the minimum amount possible for granted. So I guess in physics, people sometimes say they want a theory of everything, fundamental theory of physics, so simple you could write up on the front of a T-shirt. If I'm right in this view of consciousness, what we also ultimately want for a theory of consciousness is fundamental principles governing consciousness. So simple, you could write them on the front of a T-shirt. Now, we don't have anything like that yet. Any T-shirt theory of consciousness anyone has now is almost certainly wrong. But think of that as an aim. You want to infer simple, basic, universal, fundamental principles. Simple, basic, not explain universal. They don't just apply to us, humans with our brains, but ultimately the principles that might explain apply to dogs or cats or ants if they're conscious, or Martians if they exist, and on you go. And the thought is, the basic thought here is actually kind of simple. How do you get such a science? We just gather up a whole bunch of third-person data about physical processes, and especially in conscious systems. Gather up the first-person data about their conscious experiences, and try and abstract out the simplest correlations between the two, the principles governing them. Take that data and do a bunch of data mining to find out what are the connections here. Just at least do science in the normal way, formulate hypotheses, test them, refute them, refine them, and on you go. Now, of course, that much being said, it's a lot more complicated than that. There are serious obstacles in the science of consciousness in particular. And really, I think the obstacles come from data gathering. There are obstacles to the gathering of relevant third-person data because we don't have nearly sophisticated enough methods of monitoring the relevant neural states at the moment. And this is kind of brought out by the fact that a lot of these experiments we have to do in monkeys. But of course, in monkeys, you've got a really serious limitation for the science of consciousness. We don't have verbal report, which is our single best method of getting at states of consciousness. So that's a limitation. You can imagine that as the technology gets better and we get more sophisticated brain imaging technologies in coming decades, and maybe there's going to be prospect for vast advances on the study of the neural correlates of consciousness in humans, for example. But there are also even more serious limitations on the gathering of first-person data. And the worry is basically the obvious worry that, well, there are a bunch of worries, but perhaps the most obvious worry is the worry that that subjective experience is in a certain sense private and very hard to observe from the third-person point of view. I know my own states of consciousness, you know yours, but it's very difficult for one person to tell another person's state of consciousness. I mean, this is the point where things would be a whole lot easier if we had the mythical consciousness meter, which I just, waving Alex's head, searching for consciousness, and up comes a picture of a beetle on the screen. Alex's consciousness of a beetle. At the same time, we could monitor Alex's brain states with an ultra super brain imager and get the data of consciousness along with the brain data and then correlate the two. But alas, we don't have a consciousness meter. I gave a talk on this stuff at the CIA a few years ago. I don't know why they invited me. But maybe they wanted to hear some foundational ideas, and I don't know what they're expecting, but they didn't get it. Most of these are sort of you wondering and dropping off. Boring. Until I got to the consciousness meter. And it's like, boy, we could really use one of those. We solve a whole bunch of those ethical issues about waterboarding. So we would bring a whole bunch of new ones, and new ethical issues next week. There is actually a picture of a consciousness meter on my website. It's devised using a combination of transpersonal psychology, quantum gravity, and neuromorphic engineering. It only looks like a hairdryer.
I was wondering, you just mentioned one kind of NCC. There's also different candidates, both electrical frequency, area of the brain, type of firing, structure of firing, the list goes on. And now to evolutionary information theory. Do you think that first-person data can give us any idea of which of these are the likely candidate for an NCC? I mean, where do we even start looking? Is first-person data going to help us?
Yeah, I guess I'd say not obviously. I mean, not obviously on its own, but that I think the first-person data are fairly neutral on the underlying structures in the brain. And you're absolutely right that in considering neural correlates of consciousness, we sort of restrict ourselves to local properties of the brain, the various global and informational properties of the brain. I think that what you end up doing here, and I think even what people like Tononi and others end up doing, is to try to find the features of the brain that correlate the best with first-person features of consciousness. Tononi thinks that, as a matter of empirical fact, that these information integration properties, that basically takes to be an empirical question. You've got to go out there and do the experiments and measure the properties and find out, it might turn out some local property really covariates well with visual consciousness, or it might turn out some global property covariates better. I think in that process, the first-person data will serve as a constraint. I mean, you've got to have them to know. You've got to know what the first-person data are to find what correlates with it. But I certainly don't think they'll do that on their own. It's just something for which you need the two kinds of data in combination.
Are you at all worried about the methodological puzzle posed by that block that covariance is not going to get us to any kind of true consciousness correlate? It's going to get us to a report correlate?
Yeah, so this is where it really ties into the issue about the consciousness meter. What is the best consciousness meter that we actually have at the moment in the absence of that one that gives you a direct readout? Well, it's precisely verbal reports. And you might say, well, okay, well, how do we know that people making verbal reports are conscious? They could be zombies. Well, I think at this point you've got to make assumptions that, just as in ordinary science, you assume that perception is a pretty good guide to the physical world. We can't prove that we're not brains and bats, but methodologically we assume that perception is reliable, roughly, unless we have certain specific reasons to think otherwise, for known illusion, for example. I think likewise, you've got to think, I think my attitude to science and consciousness is that verbal reports have a role analogous to that of, say, perception. In the physical world, you've got to assume that you can basically take the attitude of assuming that people's verbal reports are accurate guides to their consciousness in the absence of specific reasons to believe otherwise, like known errors and biases of introspection. And that's the assumption that makes a science of consciousness possible. But now there is this further worry, which I think is basically Bloch's worry. What if there's a whole lot of consciousness that we can't report? I think, what's a whole bunch of the physical world out there we can't perceive? You've got to take there's different attitudes you can take at this point. One is there any evidence for there being this kind of consciousness we can't report? I mean, I think Ned thinks there's certain kinds of very indirect reasons to believe in that. I'm somewhat suspicious about the individual cases. Although one place you really might worry is consciousness outside attention. You might think, okay, boy, this is pretty plausible. There's a lot of consciousness outside our attention. Very hard to report that. How do I report what's going on in the fringes of my visual field? Well, by attending to it, I can report it. But then arguably I've transformed the phenomenon. That's then consciousness within attention. So maybe consciousness outside attention is something that we can't report or even easily introspect. I mean, the weaker approach to take is at least there's some kind of consciousness of which we have data. That's the kind of consciousness we can report and attend to introspect. And in the first instance, let's go science of those things. And I think that's basically what goes on right now in the science of consciousness. I'd be happy if we ended up with a pretty good science of those things, of the central cases of consciousness. That would still leave a further question open. What about the possibility of further cases of consciousness outside report? Consciousness outside attention. I mean, right now, you've got the situation. Some people think there is consciousness outside attention. Some people think there's not. And the sense we have of such consciousness outside attention is just comes from the ability we have to attend to it. And then it's like a refrigerator light illusion. Whenever we open the fridge, the light's on, so the light was on all along. Well, maybe not. Maybe attending to it made it conscious. Look, I think that's a really serious methodological worry. I don't have a good solution to that. I wish I did. But I do think, though, that the science of consciousness can proceed in the central cases without it. And then the hope is somewhere along the way we might come up with special empirical or philosophical methods to resolve that. Yeah, so let's go. So that gets at the second method. Look, there's the worry about privacy, the worry about methods. Methods for investigating states of consciousness from the inside, which are really terribly primitive right now, at least as used in current science. Are you experiencing red or not? Our methods for investigating first-person data just aren't anywhere near as sophisticated as our methods for investigating third-person data. Here is where, at least I'd like to think that Western science and philosophy can actually learn things from some other traditions that spend a whole lot more time on investigating consciousness from the inside, whether various Eastern traditions coming from Buddhist philosophy and the like, Western phenomenology coming from people like Husserl and Brentano, and so on. Maybe even ideas that were big in sort of 19th and early 20th century introspective psychology. There's a whole lot of this stuff. I mean, that ended up. The last of those ended up collapsing under its own weight when it turned out that purely introspective psychology led to certain intractable debates, and so on. Again, the fact there are certain areas where there are intractable debates, like is there certain kinds of imageless thoughts and so on, doesn't mean there aren't areas where there's not intractable debates, and there aren't central cases. So I think one could try to take on certain introspective and phenomenological methods as a kind of data gathering method, without necessarily endorsing all the metaphysical conclusions, say, that Buddhist philosophy or whatever has led to the metaphysical conclusions. Use that as a method of data gathering, at least in the central cases, and gradually try to increase the sophistication of our method. There's also the issue of needing a language for the description of consciousness. Formalism for representing that in the science. If you're going to have a real science with these first-person data, you're going to have ways of, writing down your data in a logbook and representing it for the purposes of formulating these principles connecting physical processes to consciousness. What's the best formalism for representing states of consciousness? Right now, we don't have really good formalisms. We basically use our language for describing the world. Experiences as of red, experiences of squareness, experiences of chairs, and I guess someone like Alex is going to do that well and proper, because that's this is what states of consciousness fundamentally are, representational states. But that's another area where these things really need developing. So I think, basically, this is the science of consciousness moving ahead a pace like this, and the first-person data really are a distinctive thing. They do pose these distinctive challenges. And I think in the long run, for the advance and the real development of this science, we're going to need methods for studying and representing first-person data that are analogous in their sophistication to their methods for third-person data. And right now, that's a pretty serious challenge. Time for
Yeah. So I like the suggestions that you made, and my worry is that once we get a really good sort of account of the first-person phenomenon and a really good account of the third-person phenomenon, the hard problems sort of start to look a whole lot less hard. So take something like, go back to Titchener's lab manual for how to do introspective psychology. He gets us to focus on the range of tones that we're sensitive to discriminating when we hear something that we take to be a primitive, simple tone, and gets us to extract all of the different components out of that. Once we sort of start paying attention to how sensitive we are to discriminating these various low-level phenomena, and we start getting down to the level of mechanisms where we're sort of picking out which ones are sensitive to each of these tones, and get nice correlations between these, it looks like there's very little left over that we're going to really want to explain. We've got a full account of what we're sensitive to, what we're discriminating. I mean, of course, we're going to need an account of why we privilege these first-person sorts of experiences over experiences that we have of other people's experience. But I mean, it's the Denenian project now looks a lot more plausible once you sort of start getting these.
That's what I don't see. I certainly agree that after you've got this kind of thing, then you start to get potentially really useful explanations of states of consciousness. Nothing about that project suggests to me this is a wholly reductive explanation. I think if you look at the way that one Titchener did it, it was explicitly a non-reductive project. You got these states of consciousness taken for granted. You find these discriminatory mechanisms that correlate with them. You say, okay, this underlying informational state, this state of consciousness. Now, as you said so far, that's a non-reductive project. It just takes consciousness for granted and correlates it with these things. So I want to now use this to support the reductive project or Dan Dennis project. The claim can be, well, once you've explained all those kinds of discrimination, you've thereby explained the state of consciousness. I just don't see anything there that has a bearing on the basic underlying question. Why does all that discrimination have to be accompanied by consciousness at all? Why couldn't it have gone on without consciousness? That experimental paradigm just assumes the existence of consciousness, assumes these data, and correlates them. I mean, you'd have to do a whole bunch of extra philosophy to get to it. And that's explaining everything that he's explaining. And that philosophy would basically probably end up making the questions in a way that didn't really turn on the details of these experiments, but on some prior.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is going to, and I know you've got lots of things to say about this as well, the question is going to be about whether we get any better reductive sorts of explanations in any other sorts of sciences.
Yeah.
And my inclination is to think that we probably don't, given that they get much beyond the level of these real tight correlations between different levels of explanation, whether it's between neurons and consciousness or individual behaviors and social interactions. Or
I guess I'm inclined to think that that's not the case in a lot of areas of science. It's not to get to correlation. Hey, we've got a DNA, you've got a gene. Rather, you still have the DNA story in enough detail, and you've basically explained the phenomenon. One of the ways, actually, one of the signals of this is in a whole bunch of areas of science. Once you get an explanation of a low-level phenomena like, say, genes or life or metabolism, or whatever, people in the science often they stop using the term gene or life and so on because they understand the phenomena well enough. They just don't need it. They say, okay, well, you've got this. Turns out the notion of gene splits 5 different ways. You say transmit this and you encode that, and you know what you need to know. So I'm very skeptical that will ever happen for the science of consciousness. The analog would be to say, well, we get, okay, well, this is discriminated, and this is the threshold for this, and so on. You never actually mention states of consciousness, and then you wouldn't need to mention them because you know what you need to know in doing the underlying stuff. It seems to me that would just leave out the central data of the science of consciousness, in which the similar attitude towards the gene doesn't seem to leave out.
Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. But, Dave, thanks so much.